When I think of the year I turned 8, I don't see calendars or clocks. I see the way afternoon light slid along the hallway in our small bungalow on Juniper Lane, turning the scuffed floorboards into honey. I hear the dog tags of our mutt Copper clinking as he trotted after anyone with a snack. I smell cinnamon and dish soap and the faint medicinal note that clung to my mother's scrubs. We were not grand, not impressive, but we were together, and together made every corner feel like home. My name is Marin Vale. My brother Luca was 10 that spring, elbows and opinions, and my sister Pippa was 6, a freckled echo at my heels. My father Caleb worked with his hands, a carpenter turned small contractor, whose left thumb had a crescent scar from a misjudged chisel. My mother Evelyn drew blood at a clinic off Roosevelt Road. She tied her hair with the same neatness she tied our lunches, precise knots, nothing loose enough to trip you. On Saturdays, we walked to Bramble Park with kites that rarely flew, and on rainy days, we made paper cranes at the kitchen table until our fingertips were speckled with glue. Sundays had their own gravity. Dad would whisk batter in a mixing bowl old enough to have outlived 3 different whisks, and he'd pour circles onto a griddle until the kitchen smelled like a bakery. He called them cloud cakes because he flipped them while telling us with complete seriousness that if you cut a pancake carefully, you could predict the weather. Pippa believed him. Luca pretended he didn't. I set forks in a straight line and pretended not to notice when Copper snuck a piece from under the edge of the table. I didn't know then that families can change shape overnight. I thought the walls knew us and would hold. The first hairline crack was a whisper I wasn't meant to hear. Dad came home late one evening in early fall, Boots' heavy voice soft enough to make the house lean closer. Mom was waiting at the sink, her back a question mark. They went with another firm, he said. The city job. The words slid into the drain with the dishwater and left a ring. Mom didn't raise her voice, not then. She just placed a plate on the rack so carefully it didn't make a sound. After that, the mail felt different. Envelopes thick with numbers arrived with the stubborn regularity of dandelions. Mom's schedule changed. She added early draws and late ones, days that smeared into nights. Dad took meetings at our wobbly dining table with men whose watches flashed when they gestured. He talked about margins and bids and weather as if rain had a personal vendetta. Small things shifted before the large ones fell. The joke jar on the counter, the place we stuffed slips of paper with our best one-liners, grew dusty. Lucas stopped asking for rides to practice and said he was taking a break from the team. Pippa began to sleep with her head at the foot of her bed, because the monsters under it hadn't yet learned to look the other way. I started packing lunches for 3, drawing shaky stars on napkins so it wouldn't feel like a chore. The loud, bright holidays we'd known shrank to a pinprick that winter. We strung lights around the living room window and called it good. No tree because Dad said we'd get one when the big invoice cleared. It must have taken a wrong turn and never found us. Mom made a small roast and stirred gravy with intense concentration as if the right texture might fix a bigger problem. Our grandparents came by one afternoon, hands clasped, voices low, and there was an offer in the air I couldn't parse help, but with conditions that chafed pride. I remember my father standing taller than usual and saying, "We've got it, thank you." He didn't. We didn't. The day the wall met my father's fist was not the beginning, only evidence. The drywall gave with a sound like a shallow breath. Dust settled along the carpet where Pippa would later kneel and trace the hole's edges with a cautious finger. Afterward, Dad slept on the couch to think as if thinking could only be done horizontally and with the television flickering scenes that required nothing of him. In the morning, our house smelled like coffee and apology, but neither was quite enough. Nights stretched. Mom's footsteps left at dawn, returned whenever the clinic had been emptied of everyone else's emergencies. Sometimes Copper and I heard her keys at nearly midnight. Sometimes not at all. I learned the rhythm of 2 alarm clocks, hers and mine. I made sure Pippa's socks matched and that Luca took the homework he'd finished under the lamp in the corner face intent, jaw tight, his pencil carving grooves into cheap paper. I was not a hero. I was a kid with a checklist. One afternoon, coming home from a classmate's birthday party with a plastic crown as a party favor, I paused at my parents' door because their voices were a river you couldn't help wading into. "We can't keep pretending this is temporary," Mom said. "Caleb, we're drowning." Dad's silence was a room by itself. Then quietly, "We separate. For a while." The words had the quality of something already decided. There are sentences adults use that make children into furniture. Who goes where was one of them. I heard my name as absence. Luca, he needs a man to show him the ropes, would go with Dad for a few months, maybe a year, until the business steadies. Pippa, she's little, she needs her mother, would stay with Mom until school ends. Nothing about me. Not Marin, who set all the forks straight. I lay on my back that night and counted the paper constellations I had taped to my ceiling months before the ones Dad claimed looked like nail heads of the universe. The tape had peeled at one corner of Orion. The hunter fell toward my pillow shore. I thought if I lay very still, gravity would take pity. The morning Luca left posed as an ordinary day. I woke to the sound of the hall closet door sliding on its stubborn track. In the living room, 2 bulging garbage bags leaned against the couch, the way tired people do. Luca's backpack was open on the floor. Dad crouched to tie his shoelace and flinched when he noticed me at the doorway. "We're taking a trip for a bit," he said, letting the end of the sentence evaporate before it hit the ground. "Be good for your mom." Luca hugged me with the speed of boys who are embarrassed by their own tenderness. "I'll call," he said into my hair like a promise made to a mirror. His eyes were red, which he pretended was pollen. Copper paced, then settled by the window as if he understood leaving from shadows on the lawn. After the car pulled away, Mom went into her room and latched the door. The sound was delicate and final, a teacup placed just so. I knocked until my knuckles felt hot. "Mom." No answer. Pippa stood at my elbow with her stuffed rabbit button, its fabric thinned to the weave at one ear. "Is this another game?" she asked. Where we hide, I told her we were going to have pancakes for dinner, and she believed me because believing is its own kind of shelter. Day 1, without Luca and Dad, we ate pancakes and pretended breakfast foods meant stability. Day 2, I poured cereal for Copper because no one else had, and he looked at me with the humble gratitude dogs have perfected. Day 3, the milk turned, and we tried toast with jam, the knife skittering across the bread and onto my fingers. I didn't cry. I washed the sticky away and told Pippa a story about a girl whose paper cranes learned to fly. On the 4th day, Mom emerged with a suitcase already zipped. Her face had a practiced calm I recognized from crowded clinic waiting rooms. "We're going to Aunt Ria's for a little while," she said, smoothing Pippa's hair, eyes skipping over me, the way people skip over an obstacle when they're carrying something heavy. "When will we come back?" I asked. "Soon," she said. "Stay here in case your father returns. He'll be worried if the house is empty." She was a nurse. She knew how to dress a wound with words. It still bled. Pippa clung to me until Mom uncurled her fingers one by one. "I'll send you a postcard," my sister promised, with the solemnity of 6-year-olds who think mail can fix the world. Then the door closed behind them, and Copper nosed it as if a better push would change the outcome. I told myself it was an adventure. I moved my pillow to the couch because the living room had more windows. I turned on every lamp. I boiled pasta and forgot to salt the water. I made 2 piles of laundry, the one that smelled like us, and the one that smelled like a house left too long with the shades drawn. At night, every noise felt like the beginning of a story I didn't want to hear. Copper slept with his chin on my ankle as if anchoring us in case the floor decided to leave. Hunger is unglamorous. It doesn't sharpen you. It dulls and narrows. By the 3rd morning alone, the refrigerator held only an argument between condiments. I found crackers and a heel of cheese and divided them like communion. I called Dad and got a recorded woman who told me to leave a message. I called Mom and heard a ring that went on until it stopped being a ring and became a curtain. My messages were the same. Come home. I'm here. I didn't know which part mattered more. The knock at the door came in the late afternoon, when the house had the lemon-tinged light of a photograph from the 70s. Mrs. Patel from 2 doors down stood on our step with her soft cardigan and sharp eyes. She had seen me walking Copper alone. She had counted days without the sight of my mother's car. "Is your mom in Marin?" she asked, and it was the kindest possible trap. I lied. She waited. Copper, traitor to secrecy and ally to my better future, wagged without conviction. It did not take much. My throat closed around my story, and then the story pushed through anyway. The trip that was not a trip. The suitcase that meant the kind of leaving a child isn't meant to name the milk gone bad, the lights left on the messages floating in a nowhere that doesn't call back. Mrs. Patel's mouth pressed thin. She put a hand on my shoulder as if checking my temperature. "Get your shoes," she said, "and button for your sister because she assumed Pippa was in the next room." I shook my head. "She's gone," I said. "They all are." Mrs. Patel fed me rice with turmeric and peas and called someone from a list she kept near her phone. The woman who arrived wore a navy blazer and flats that didn't squeak. "Ms. Delaney," she said, offering me her first name and then thinking better of it, retreating behind the last. She spoke to me at my height, not hers, and told me things in sentences with verbs. "You will come with me tonight. We will make sure Copper is safe. We will try to contact your parents." She helped me fill a small backpack, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of socks, my toothbrush, a library book that was due Tuesday. I took Button because Pippa had left it, because someone should keep it warm. Copper went reluctant and confused into the backseat of a neighbor's car destined for a shelter where he would be looked after, which sounded like a spell and felt like a theft. At the courthouse, the ceilings were high and the chairs were too. A man in a robe with a face like a concerned grandfather said my full name and made it official that I belonged to the state for now until the adults who had mislaid me figured out how to hold things again. He spoke gently, but the gavel's tap might as well have been a lock sliding into place. I watched the grown-ups talk around me with fierce efficiency, papers passing like playing cards in a game I did not know. Ms. Delaney's pen made neat notes. Mrs. Patel squeezed my hand and told me I had done everything right, though I had done nothing at all except survive the kind of week children shouldn't have. Someone asked if there were relatives they could call. Aunt Rhea was a name without a number. Somewhere my brother had a new bedtime. Somewhere my sister would fall asleep curled around air. They took me to a house I'd never been in with a welcome mat that said, "Bless this mess," in cheerful letters large enough to be untrue. The woman who opened the door smelled like vanilla candles and something bitter under it. She showed me a fold-out couch with a quilt that had squares stitched by hands that did not know mine. I placed Button on the pillow, turned out the lamp, and lay still enough to hear the world consider me. Houses remember. Ours would keep the mark in the drywall for years a question in the shape of a fist. Juniper Lane would go on with its trash day and sprinklers and bicyclists who obeyed stop signs. My mother's neat knots would hold other people's lives together because she was good at that. My father's hands would keep measuring distance. Copper's collar would rattle in a different kitchen if anyone thought to let him wear it. I had learned something without choosing it: how quickly a family can become a story told in past tense. How a child can become a name on a file. How silence multiplies when you feed it. I didn't have a plan, only the next morning to wake into and a notepad Ms. Delaney gave me, where I wrote the things I needed to remember. Library card. Luca's old jacket. Button belongs to Pippa. Tell someone about Copper. Someone. The honey light of our hallway did not follow me. It stayed where it belonged, in a house on Juniper Lane, in a world that had not yet been asked to break. The fold-out couch kept my outline by morning, as if the quilt had learned my shape. Vanilla drifted from a plug-in down the hall, trying to sweeten a house that didn't know my name. Mrs. Henley's shoulders' brisk smile practice showed me where to put my backpack, a plastic bin under the coffee table. "Just for now," she said, and the words made a tent I couldn't stand up in. "Just for now" lasted 3 months. The Henleys had 3 kids and a calendar bristling with color-coded boxes. I learned their rules by missing them shoes off, but not their snacks. Only after 4:30 quiet hours that arrived before homework could. I slept where the television had left faint ghosts on the wall, folding the couch each morning so my bed wouldn't be in anyone's way. My things never graduated from the bin. When I asked about a drawer, Mrs. Henley said, "We like to keep common spaces clear." I tried to make myself a common space. School became the easiest room to breathe. I sat near the radiator where the noise covered the part of me that didn't want attention. In science, I filled margins with diagrams I pretended were notes. At lunch, I ate quickly and counted the tiles above the water fountain, because counting gives a person a way to finish something. The social worker changed in the 2nd month. Ms. Delaney moved to a different caseload. A man named Mr. Kerr arrived with a neat binder and the kind of pen that clicks only once. He asked if I was sleeping, if I felt safe. I said yes, because the opposite would have set too many things in motion. He nodded, ticked boxes, reminded me he was there if I needed anything. When he left, his cologne stayed longer than his promises. In December, I found a birthday card on the fold-out addressed in a hand I didn't know. Inside, a printed cupcake and 2 words. "Happy birthday." No return address, no name. I stared until the letters blurred and then slid it under my pillow anyway. People imagine big moments come with trumpets. Mostly they come as paper you can misplace. The second house was the Ortiz apartment, a 4th-floor walk-up that smelled like cumin and pine sol. Ms. Ortiz liked order the way some people like music. There were chore charts and bathroom timers and a pantry with labels in black marker. The timer ticked while I brushed my teeth. When it rang, I rinsed even if I had foam in the corners of my mouth. "We do what we can with what we have," Miss Ortiz said, and her voice made it almost fine. There were 6 of us in 2 bedrooms, a tangle of elbows and borrowed sweaters. An older girl, Kara, collected found things, keychains, ticket stubs, a broken watch face, and kept them in a shoebox under her bed, like proof that life left clues. She taught me how to braid my hair tight enough to last all day. She also taught me to keep my few treasures out of sight. After my first week, the cheap locket Mrs. Patel had pressed into my palm for luck turned up on another girl's neck. When I asked for it back, she said, "What locket?" and smiled with her mouth closed. I learned to choose my losses. I learned that a cup of tea can make a kitchen feel like a chapel if everyone agrees to be quiet while the kettle works. I learned to sleep with my hand inside my pillowcase where I kept my library card and the laminated photo from 2nd grade me with a crooked grin, Copper's paw just visible at my knee. Spring brought a move without warning. A better fit, Mr. Kerr said, his binder open to the page where my name lived between tabs. The Klein house had a white fence and a wreath on the door that changed with the season. Inside, words could cut. Mrs. Klein spoke like a seamstress, ripping out stitches, efficient, tidy, no apology. "Stand tall, dear, you're not a question mark." Smile properly, there's no reason to sulk. I earned B pluses and she pinned them to the fridge with a sigh. So close, she said, as if the space between a minus and a plus were the difference between being invited and being tolerated. I learned invisibility like a language. If I anticipated enough, I could dodge the worst of her neat disapproval. It worked until it didn't. On a Sunday, I broke a plate. It split with a sound like a thin shout. Mrs. Klein looked at me and said gently, "Now you see why people hesitate," and I understood exactly what she meant. The next time Mr. Kerr asked if I felt safe, I said yes and watched his pen do its small work. The Danners came after a brown house with a sagging porch and a living room where the blinds stayed closed even at noon. Mr. Danner worked nights and slept with the television on. Mrs. Danner stored cereal in a cupboard I couldn't reach and kept a notebook of rules that was longer than the list of groceries. Snacks were contraband. Hunger was discipline. At 14 thin, with a sharp kind of tired, I climbed out the window one warm night and didn't come back for 3 days. The city isn't kind to children who pretend to be invisible. It sees them too clearly. A police officer found me near the river, my shoes wet, my hands sticky with the sugar of stolen fruit, and returned me to the office where Mr. Kerr's binder lived. The Danners said I had broken their trust. It felt mutual. Transitional housing came next. A room in a duplex with a couple who left pamphlets about salvation on the kitchen table and asked about my soul between refills of lemonade. They meant well in a way that bruised. I went to school, came home, worked through worksheets, and slept in a bed that felt slightly hostile to dreams. The person who saw past the paperwork was a guidance counselor named Miss Shu. She had a drawer full of granola bars and a wall full of college pennants. When she handed back my standardized tests, she tapped the top page with her pencil. "You're quick," she said, not like a compliment, but like a diagnosis. She slid a form toward me. Honors English, Algebra 2. Will ask. You can do it. In her office, asking was a form of belief. That fall, a placement arrived like a pause. Harriet Ames, a retired librarian in a salt-colored cardigan with a house that smelled like book spines and oranges. She didn't hug me at the door. She put my duffel on a chair by a window and said, "Your room is at the top of the stairs left. Sheets are clean. Dinner is at 6, even if we're not hungry. House rules are on the fridge. They're short on purpose. The rules were crisp. Tell the truth, wash your hands, do your work at the table so I can help if you stall. You don't have to call me anything you don't mean," she added and meant it. Routine rebuilt the edges of my days. Harriet's clock chimed a small firm hour at 6. We ate even if it was only soup and toast. Homework happened at the table under a lamp that made the wood look warmer than it was. At 9, we read separately together, her in an armchair, me on the rug, feet near the register. On Fridays, she pulled recipes from a tin and let me choose one. We burned the first batch of scones and ate them anyway with too much jam. She noticed my notebook full of sketches and didn't make noisier praise than the moment required. She set a clean sketch pad by my plate the next night and kept walking. When I finished a portrait of her, hands folded on the table, she said, "May I?" and pinned it in the hall with the same care. She gave family photographs of children she had once fostered, who were now taller than their own hesitations. I took longer breaths in that hallway. When winter came, Harriet wore a knit cap indoors and insisted she was chilly in the scalp, which made sense only later. The diagnosis was a sentence delivered in a doctor's voice that had too much kindness in it to be good news. Harriet told me at breakfast with the grapefruit halves already salted. "I have an illness that will end things sooner than I planned," she said, not asking me to feed her comfort she hadn't ordered. "We'll keep the routine." We did, even as the routine shifted to include pill bottles lined like small soldiers, and afternoons when she slept while the house became extra quiet to make room for it. Hospice came like a new type of visitor. I took the bus after school and read aloud from whatever book she pointed to with the tip of her finger. Sometimes cookbooks, sometimes atlases. I learned the names of places I could not yet pronounce. The last week, her breathing made a soft sough of the room. When she didn't need the lamp anymore, I turned it off and sat, with the kind of silence that refuses to be described. The service was small. A handful of former fosters shook my hand in the church basement and told me what she had meant in a language made of nods. I walked back to the duplex with the pamphlets and set my duffel by the door as if I might leave more quickly if I didn't let it settle. On the morning I turned 18, the state turned me into a signature. Ms. Yu slid an envelope across her desk, a letter on thick paper from the city college, a scholarship that covered more than I'd expected and less than I needed, a bus pass, clipped with a paperclip shaped like a star. I owned one suitcase and a plastic bin and a second-hand coat, whose lining made a whisper when I moved. I stood on the curb with the envelope in my pocket, and the cold stitching my fingers into fists until they remembered how to open. The envelope, with the star-shaped paperclip, stayed in my coat pocket so long the corners went soft. When I finally unfolded it at the kitchen table of the duplex, the words looked taller than I felt admissions award bus pass. I traced the ridges the clip had left, then slid the letter back into the pocket as if the paper were something that might break if I let it out too long. That morning, the air outside bit cleanly. I stood at the curb with my duffel and the plastic bin that had followed me through houses, waiting for a bus whose route I'd memorized but never ridden end to end. The room I found belonged to 3 other girls, already a narrow apartment above a laundromat, where the floor hummed gently like a cat. We split space with tape and courtesy, a mattress on a frame for me, a curtain tacked across a half closet, a hook for my coat. Rent was a number that required 2 jobs and a new understanding of sleep. I took early shifts at a diner that still buttered toast with a brush, then closed 3 nights a week at a shop in the mall where all the clothes had complicated names for simple fabric. I learned the city's schedule by the backs of delivery trucks and the smell of bread at dawn. Classes began in rooms with chalk still on the window ledges. I sat near doors out of habit and kept my notebooks neat enough to pass for confidence. In art history, Professor Adler mispronounced my last name the first day, and never again the kind of care that lands quietly and stays. He walked us through images like cities you could enter if you asked the right question. My questions were mostly drawings in the margins, arches becoming elbows, chiaroscuro becoming a dog's ear. Negative space making room for a face I was not ready to name. One afternoon, as I closed my notebook, Adler stopped me with 2 fingers on the cover. "May I?" he asked, and flipped pages as if they were maps. "Composition," he said, finally tapping a quick portrait of a girl asleep on the L, her head against the window, the station names reflected backwards in the glass. "You see how weight sits in places most people don't look." He said it without inflation, the way you mention the weather when the sky clarifies. He gave me a list of studio courses and a name in financial aid. "Ask," he added, and wrote his initials at the bottom of the page, as if that might argue for me in rooms I hadn't entered. Asking did not open every door, but it opened enough. Someone in an office liked the way I arranged my verbs. A scholarship slid across a counter with a stapled cover sheet. I went from 2 jobs to 1.5. I learned the gallery's backrooms as a work-study assistant, crates that smelled like cedar gloves turned inside out and lined on a radiator, the patient efficiency of measuring tape. I learned to handle what other people called priceless by treating it as if it belonged to the air. Careful, steady, never forcing weight where it didn't want to go. In those years, people who weren't my family started acting like family without saying the word. Nova Chen, who had a planner for a brain and taught me to budget using color pencils, hung a string of lights in our kitchen and declared them permanent. Rafi wrote poems on the backs of receipts during his barista shifts and taped them above my desk with blue painter's tape because it doesn't peel paint. He claimed the tape was a metaphor for gentle commitments, then laughed when I raised an eyebrow. Leah studied respiratory therapy and always noticed when I was holding my breath. On Thanksgiving, Nova's mother insisted I sit near the window because light likes your face, a sentence that felt like a warm hand. I met Theo March in a figure drawing class when the model was late and our instructor asked us to draw each other's hands. Mine came out like instruments. His looked like they were about to speak. He listened with the patience of someone who understood there are parts of a story people can tell only when their pulse has slowed. We walked home in the same direction twice a week and learned the names of trees we passed by the shape of their evening shadows. When he asked months later about my childhood, I answered as if flipping through a deck of photographs I'd shuffled too many times, here and here and here. He did not try to order them, only held the space while I chose which to put back in the box. At the counseling center, 2 floors above the bookstore, that never had the addition my professors wanted, there were chairs too soft and a clock that ticked louder when I was silent. The therapist had a ring with a stone the color of lake water. Her questions were measured and durable. We constructed a vocabulary for sensations that until then had looked like weather. I learned the names of storms and how to stand in a doorway until they passed. Graduation did not feel like a finish line so much as the removal of temporary scaffolding. My cap sat wrong. The gown made everyone look like a choir. In the crowd, I found Nova's face and Theo's hands clapping, and when I glanced toward the doors, out of nothing but reflex, there was no father's shoulders, no mother's necklace to recognize. I did not look twice. I allowed myself 1 trip to the bathroom to breathe and press a cold paper towel to my wrists, then walked back into a room fuller than any I'd stood in before. The first gallery job I landed paid almost nothing and cost 2 bus transfers each way, and I took it without blinking. The director Soren dressed like a bruise and spoke like a curator in a century where adjectives were rationed. "We like your eye," he said, as if an eye could be a team member. He sent me to studios that still smelled of turpentine, and to warehouse shows that happened at midnight, showed me spreadsheets as intimately as he showed me catalogs. I learned to hang a show in a storm when the power blinked and came back, not quite aligned with its former self. I learned to write wall text that didn't behave like a lecture. I learned to introduce an artist to a buyer without selling either one more than they could afford. Rent stabilized via a roommate swap and a landlord who liked tenants who paid on the first without reminders. Theo and I failed quietly at being a couple for a while and then succeeded at being two people careful with each other. Success looked smaller than movies promised and more maintainable, a plant that kept living the heat working in January, a corner of a closet we renamed the archive for boxes of drawings and photographs that would matter later, even if we didn't yet know how. On a Saturday in late spring, the gallery hosted an opening where the air itself felt curated. The crowd, the canapes, the string quartet that played 2 rooms over, so the sound arrived, softened by walls. A critic used the word luminous about a painter I'd convinced Soren to show. The word found its way into the paper the next morning, and then into the painter's bio, where it would live for longer than the paint would take to dry. I itemized receipts for expenses and felt inexplicably like someone had handed me a small, unexpected inheritance. Not money, but faith that did not require begging. By 27, I had saved enough for a lease on a small storefront 2 blocks south of a place where people lined up for donuts on Sundays. It was a former bookstore with a stubborn back door and a ceiling high enough for a ladder that frightened me. I painted the walls myself with the help of 3 friends and a playlist, and when I opened, I did not give the space a grand name. I put my own name in low letters on the window because I liked the look of vacancies filled slowly. In the first year, my artists were mostly local and mostly underrepresented. A printmaker who worked days at a packaging plant, a sculptor whose medium was reclaimed construction material, a painter who had traveled as a home health aide with watercolors tucked into a toiletries bag. We mounted shows that felt like conversations. People came, then brought other people. A columnist from a neighborhood paper stopped by on a rainy Tuesday and wrote about the tin ceiling like it was a character I'd hired. When a sale cleared that allowed me to pay an artist more than their rent that month, I closed the backroom door and cried in a practical way, quietly, like I didn't want the paint to hear. I bought a used desk with drawers and a file cabinet where contracts could live in alphabetical peace. I turned the track lights each morning and let the click of the switches be the day's first good sentence. The condo came later after a season of shows that paid on time and a season of shows that did not. It was a 1-bedroom in a converted warehouse with windows that made the walls feel humble by comparison. The first night, I sat on the floor and listened to the way the building carried other people's lives. A laugh, water in pipes, someone practicing scales on a trumpet 2 floors up. All of it proof that our corners touched. I slept on a mattress without a frame and woke to a square of light on the ceiling. I took my shoes off in the doorway simply because there was a doorway that was mine. The panic attack surprised me on Michigan Avenue during a weekday too ordinary to carry anything dangerous. The man ahead of me had my father's build, the same tilt of the head before crossing, and in the second where recognition and memory misfired, my body decided we were 8 again. The sidewalk narrowed, the air leaned. A stranger asked if I was okay, and I could not trust my mouth to choose the right answer. I leaned against a cool stone facade and counted backwards by 7s until the math gave me a handle. After I took the long way home and did not pretend I was fine, I made an appointment. I kept it. I wrote the incident down in a notebook labeled privately to remind myself how the past sometimes rents a room for the afternoon without asking. My circle thickened around me in ways that didn't announce themselves. Anika, a sous chef who hosted Sunday dinners in a kitchen with a broken stove light, ladled soup into bowls that looked like they'd been found in different lives. Miles, a bike mechanic, once replaced my chain in exchange for 2 tickets to an opening and a promise I'd never ride in February without decent gloves. Eloise, a children's librarian, mailed me a postcard every time she weeded a book I would have loved at 8, a private ritual she called returning to circulation. The message from Luca arrived when the gallery was between installers and the floor was covered with brown paper taped in long, clean runs. I had a mug of coffee I'd been warming between my palms, the kind of heat that makes you feel like you're doing something on purpose. The notification blinked on my laptop, a name I had folded into the past and tucked in a drawer. The mug hit the floor with a blunt sound I felt in my ribs. For a long one breath, the only thing that existed was the text, Marin. It's me. I've been looking for you. Can we talk? My assistant Jess heard the cup came in with a towel in a small panic and then backed out when she saw my face. I sat with the message until the hour changed on the stove clock. The old machine part of my brain went to its tools list phone chair. Therapy first. Nova second. Theo third. My hands shook, but they know how to dial. In the session that followed, I stood the message up between us like a 4th chair. The therapist asked the questions I couldn't ask myself without flooding. What do you need to feel safe? What is your pace? What can you accept if answers don't arrive in the arrangement you want? No one suggested I owe anyone anything. We made a script not for pretending, but for not drowning. When I wrote back, the reply was breadcrumb short, I remember you. Yes. Luca's voice on the phone was deeper, but it carried the same cadence that had once counted out bicycle spokes while he straightened my streamers. He told me where he'd been enough to make a map that stayed on one page. Wisconsin, engineering, 2 kids who called him Dad in plural when they wanted something. He said our father lived nearby in an apartment full of the kinds of tools you keep, because their shape knows your hand. He said there had been a scare, the kind that makes families dial numbers they've kept folded in wallets. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said my name as if testing it for cracks. When I asked about Pippa, he laughed softly. She hates when we use that, he said. She goes by Pia now. He gave me a number. I did not call immediately. I let the digits sit under a magnet on my refrigerator as evidence that the world had edges I could touch without bleeding. Pia's voice arrived like the memory of a song you loved before you knew what it meant. I kept waiting for you to call me first, she said, after our second hello. And then I realized I was doing what we were taught, waiting for other people to fix what hurt. She said Mom had told her for years that I was with relatives safe, placed neatly in a story that didn't require anyone to knock on doors. I believed it until it was convenient not to, she added, and the honesty sat between us with its hands folded. Over the next weeks, the phone made new rooms for old people to stand in. Pieces of information rearranged themselves into something truer than the stories we'd been handed. Our father's drinking had been worse than I remembered. Our mother's sadness had eaten whole days and left the bones. Both had chosen quiet in the shape of not doing paperwork that would have made me visible again. Luca tried to be fair to people who hadn't been fair. Pia swung between nostalgia and a fury that warmed the line. I found myself alternating between the instinct to catalog and the need to stop writing mid-sentence. A package arrived at the gallery with a return address from a town in Ohio I'd never driven through. Inside a small box containing a stack of paper cranes flattened and refolded enough times to carry other people's fingerprints. On top, a note in my mother's hand, still exact the loops trained, read, I kept these. I should have kept you, if you can call me. I placed the cranes on the desk in a line that made them look like punctuation marks. Luca mentioned a plan for a gathering at a lake 2 states over the old place, he called it, as if nostalgia could varnish rot. He said there was a date and a hope. I looked at the calendar on my wall and at the cranes and at the brown paper covering my gallery floor and felt with clarity that surprised me that I did not belong in houses built from other people's versions of the past. I told him I would not go there. He didn't argue. Tell me what feels possible, he said, and the sentence unclenched a muscle I hadn't known was tight. Possible looked like a table where I could see the door. Possible looked like letters written separately addressing people as themselves, and not as a chorus. I set aside a night and wrote by hand on thick paper I bought from the art supply store where the clerks used first names and told elaborate stories about brushes. In each letter I built a clean sentence for the years they couldn't carry, where I had slept, what I had eaten, the names of the houses, and the ones without names, the social workers, the hole in the wall, the way Copper's collar clicked against the door when we were alone. I wrote without accusation and without forgiveness, because neither belonged to paper. I wrote so that if I sat across from them, we would not be starting from a fiction. I chose a restaurant on a street where I knew the parking would not intimidate anyone. I asked for a corner table because I prefer corners. When I hung up, I could hear the hostess's pen mark the book. I put the letters in envelopes and pressed water along the stamps like a blessing and mailed them one by one, not because the postbox needed ceremony, but because I did. The night before the date circled on my calendar, I stayed late at the gallery to finish adjusting the lights. The room took the change with its usual gray shadows, behaving highlights, finding what they needed to touch. I walked the perimeter once, then twice, as if a path could make an argument for steadiness. Outside it had begun to snow, the first tentative kind flakes as hesitant as new handwriting, dusting the sidewalk so lightly my footprints looked like they'd been written in pencil. I locked the door, put my hand flat on the cool glass, and stood long enough for my breath to fog a small oval that cleared as quickly as it formed. Then I turned and started toward home, the cranes waiting on my desk like a line I hadn't yet decided how to end. By late afternoon, the snow had turned to a fine rain that stitched the street into a dull sheen. I arrived early and chose the corner table that faced the door and the windows. The glass threw back the room in a faint duplicate, as if offering rehearsal space. I put the letters' carbon copies in my bag and ordered water I didn't drink. They came together an arrangement I recognized even after years apart. Caleb's slightly stooped jacket a size too large. Evelyn with a necklace I remembered from church Easters. Luca hovering near our father's elbow. Pia scanning until she found me. We stood at the same time and made brief, awkward contact, polite touches that acknowledged familiarity without claiming it. The host set down 4 menus and a small candle that flickered as if it knew where it was. We began with the weather and the soup. The server wrote nothing down and brought everything correctly. It felt like a good omen, and then correctly became only accurately. When the plates had been delivered and adjusted twice, my father cleared his throat. "Marin," he said, as if my name were a tool he wanted to hold correctly. I owe you." He opened his hands, then closed them. I was not. My mother spoke more quickly, as if speed could carry meaning past shame. "I read your letter," she said. "Twice. I didn't know that house, those houses." Her voice thinned. "I told myself you were placed." Placed sounded like a word that meant safe. "It didn't," I said. Silence set the table efficient and thorough. The candle guttered and regained itself. My father tried again. It was complicated. "Many things are," I said. "Some are also simple." I told them what I had written for when speaking failed: the couch that folded into my outline, the bin, the timer that cut off toothpaste, the plate that broke the cupboard. I couldn't reach the window. I climbed out of the bus, routes learned by feet, the Friday scones burned and eaten anyway. I named people they'd never met: Henley Ortiz Klein, Danner, Ms. Shu, Harriet, so they would exist in the same sentence as me. I kept my voice steady. I did not narrate. I placed facts on the table like silverware. My mother's hands shook, her napkin blurred with moisture she wouldn't call tears. "I should have come back," she said, soft but audible. "I should have found you." My father looked at the candle as if flame could arbitrate. I let the days stack. He said the words turned over carefully before use. I stopped picking up the phone because I didn't know what to say into it. "I'm not here to make either of you smaller," I said. "I'm here so that if we speak again, we're standing on the same floor." Luca exhaled like someone who had been holding a piece of furniture alone. "Thank you," he said, simple as a set-down. Pia reached toward me, then set her hand back on her lap. "You wrote about Copper's collar," she said. I could hear it. We ate enough to keep the server from worrying. The conversation moved in careful increments. My father apologized without adjectives. My mother said my name 3 times as if checking the fit. I drew lines around what could become possible and what could not. No lake house, no photographs where I am inserted like a sticker into a past. I didn't occupy no gathering that moves faster than a person can walk. Yes to coffee with Pia, to an afternoon with Luca's kids, if and when I could breathe through the idea, to keeping my own life at the center of my calendar. When the bill came, I took it. My father's hand moved. I shook my head. I wanted the clean arithmetic. Outside, the rain had settled into mist. We said goodnight under the awning. No one reached for a second hug. I walked the 2 blocks to the gallery with my bag light and my body heavier than I could account for, then turned on the track lights just to see things behave. The next week, Pia and I met at a cafe that served coffee strong enough to insist on itself. Without our parents, her voice found a register I hadn't heard over dinner. She told me about 2nd grade spelling bees she won because sound stayed obedient for her, about dance classes, and how she kept quitting when recitals crowded the calendar, about a stepfather who was kind and baffled by a grief he hadn't been assigned. Mom told stories that closed doors, she said, stirring and stirring without drinking. I kept them shut because I thought drafts were the enemy. We walked after our cups empty and our sleeves damp at the cuffs, and paused in front of a bookstore window where someone had arranged paper birds above the travel section. "You used to fold these," she said. I nodded. "You can keep doing that," she added. "You don't have to let me watch." It was a sentence that fit. Invitations arrived. A text thread began, cautious, sometimes wordless, a photograph of a sky, of a dog, of a recipe that worked. I declined a holiday gathering and sent 4 postcards instead, each with ordinary news: a shipment delayed, and then found a plant revived a morning where the street smelled faintly of oranges because a truck had spilled its cargo 2 blocks north. In the studio behind the gallery, I pinned paper to the wall and began a series without a name. The first piece was a grid of faint erased lines and a single dark arc bending through them. The second was a map of a house that never existed, a couch that folded itself a hole in a wall, a dog bed, a door that led to a door that led to a street. People stepped into the room and stood at angles I recognized from churches. A reviewer wrote the word resonant and left it there like a stone on a path. Months slid. The cranes stayed on my desk, their creases softening. One morning the phone rang with a number I did not have to check to know. My father's voice was thinner, as if someone had taken fabric out of it. "I failed you," he said, with no preface and no attempt to sand the statement. Not only then, all the days I didn't try. I'm not asking for anything. We stayed on the line without purpose until purpose felt less necessary. When he coughed, I heard old sawdust in it. After we hung up, I stood in the doorway between gallery and office and watched the light cross the floor. The series on the wall looked less like pain and more like engineering weight distributed so the structure could hold. A Saturday turned clear. Luca brought his children by unannounced, then apologized before I had to ask. They were careful with the word aunt, trying it on as if it might pinch. I showed them how to hold a level so the bubble centered. They laughed when I told them the tool's name was Honest. Pia texted a photograph of her apartment plant leafing out in improbable winter. My mother mailed a recipe card in her square handwriting for pancakes with a note at the bottom that said, "Whisk gently. It matters." That night I stayed late. I hung one more piece hands folded on a table, not Harriet's hands exactly, but the posture of her steadiness, and stepped back until the lines clicked. I turned off the track lights and the room fell into the soft geometry of after hours. In my office on the cabinet where contracts slept, I set 2 frames side by side. In one, a girl at 8 with a paper crown slightly askew the last birthday before the cracked copper's paw a blur at the edge. In the other, a recent photograph Theo had taken without asking me, at the ladder's top rung. One hand on the rail, the other reaching for a fixture. The frames didn't match. I didn't make them. I locked up and stood with my palm on the cool glass again. My breath spread and cleared. Outside the street held the kind of quiet that doesn't require listening for it. I walked home with the cranes in my bag, their wings pressing gently against my side like a reminder of something that had learned a different shape and stayed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.